So, welcome to this public webinar, which is a joint meeting hosted by the Jewish Network for Palestine and the Socialist Labour Network. I'm on the steering committee of the Socialist Labour Network and I'm chairing the meeting this evening. As Israel continues its wars in the south and north whilst practicing murderous apartheid against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, some still hold that the only way forward is to reconstitute Palestine on the basis of the tiny amount of land left to Palestinians, while somehow removing 700,000 Israeli and foreign Jewish settlers from the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So our question is, how can Israel, as a Jewish supremacist settler colony, be somehow reborn as a good neighbour to a truncated, fractured and demoralised Palestinian state? Whilst the imperialist powers, including the British Labour Party, still claim to want a two-state solution, but is it viable and is it just? How can Palestinians possibly live in peace and security next to Israel? Or, for that matter, how can Lebanon, Syria, or any other neighbouring Arab state live safely with a dangerous US client regime on their doorstep? This evening we'll be addressing some of those issues and more, and we will hear from speakers with their perspective on the future state for the people of historic Palestine. And we will hear from Tony Greenstein, Ghada Karmi, Rania Khalek, Haim Bresheeth, and Ali Abunimar. First of all, we are going to hear, in not the usual order, from our comrade, Tony Greenstein. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, thanks. Haim Bresheeth, who was supposed to be starting this off, has sound problems at the moment, so I hope he will be joining us later. The first thing I want to do is welcome everyone to the meeting. We are now 1 year after the beginning of Israel's war on the Palestinian people of Gaza, and there's no sign of it ending, quite the contrary. The war seems to be expanding first to Lebanon and quite possibly to the region as a whole. So we are in quite cataclysmic times in a sense. The question really is what conclusions we draw and what sense we make of the situation to date. And the first thing really that I want to say is that it is extremely clear what Israel's objective in Gaza is. And indeed, its objective, if it could succeed militarily in South Lebanon as a whole, and that is the ethnic cleansing of those populations. I mean, large sections of the Israeli state, the government have talked about resettling Gaza and turning it into a place where they can have hotels, beaches, tourists, and so on. So I don't think we can be under any doubt. And there's also, of course, because the original aims of Zionism were the land of Israel, and that's a biblical concept. And the land of Israel, what was apparently promised to Abraham, stretches from the Litani right down to the Nile and then across to the Euphrates in Iraq. So there's plenty of room for expansion. I'm not saying it is going to expand that far, but Israel, ideologically, Zionism has a justification for any expansion, and we can expect our Western leaders to support it in that goal. But regardless of the military outcome of the present struggles, and clearly Israel is finding great difficulty despite its overwhelming firepower in Gaza. Most people will agree it's actually suffered a military defeat there. It hasn't been able to eradicate Hamas, which simply reoccupies whatever area Israel is forced to abandon. The question is what will happen in Lebanon. Of course, Rania is more of an expert in that than me. I can just really throw out some observations. There is no doubt that the pager explosions, coupled with the assassination of Nasrallah and most of Hezbollah's military leadership, is a severe blow. I don't think we can escape that. But the key question for me is what happens with the ground invasion in the south of Lebanon. And I would expect that Hezbollah, despite the blows it suffered, will in fact turn out to repeat what happened in 2006 when Israel was forced to withdraw with heavy casualties. I mean, that's my own observations, and as say, Rania may have things to say about that as well. But whatever happens, whatever the military outcome in the short term, I have no doubt whatsoever that Israel has suffered a major political defeat in this campaign over the last year. Never has it been so clear what Israel is about. For a very long time, people swallowed the illusion spread by Zionism that you could be both a Jewish and a democratic state. And I think it should be clear to anyone who has eyes to see that those two are diametrically opposed. You can either have a Jewish state or a democratic state. You cannot have both. And in that sense, of course, Rabbi Meir Kahan of Kach, who was elected to the Knesset in 1984, and remember that even his opponents in Likud and Labour described him as a Jewish Nazi then. His heirs, Ben Gvir and Otzma Yehudit, are now part of the Israeli cabinet, and no one says a word in the West about that fact. They are also clear about Israel being a Jewish state before a democratic state. So those Western leaders who pay lip service to the idea that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East are, of course, the complete hypocrites that they are, because the reality is that whatever Israel does, it will have their sanction in the end. And we remember Joe Biden, for example, laying down all sorts of red lines. Invading Rafah was a red line, but what happened to that red line? It simply disappeared. Israel, in essence, has carte blanche almost for anything it does. And that is one of the lessons that we have to draw from this. There is really no holding back. I mean, I used to ask myself, is there anything Israel could do which the West would be vehemently opposed to and stop? And the answer I get is I don't think there is anything, maybe bar using its nuclear weapons. I mean, I can't see any limits or any restrictions, as Israel is preparing for maybe a war on Iran as well. So although Biden says he's opposed to a regional war, we can take that with a pinch of salt, to say the least. But as I said, there has been a political defeat for Zionism. And there's also, I think, the shedding of the illusion that there is a left wing and a right wing of Zionism. There are different wings of Zionism. It is clear beyond any doubt that the differences within Zionism are tactical differences at best. We have, for instance, the leader of the now the unified Meretz and the Israeli Labour Party, because what was Socialist or left Zionism has all but disappeared, Yair Golan, who was the deputy chief of staff, advocating the invasion of South Lebanon. So he's actually going in advance of some members of Likud, for example, who've been urging caution. So anyone who believes that there are real differences within Zionism is living a complete illusion. It is a lie. And we know that because the fundamental goal of Zionism always was the creation of a Jewish state. And that was based on the idea of a Jewish nation. And therefore, a nation has the right to self-determination. Of course, Jews are not a nation. They're members of every nation. But that was the essence of Zionism. that it had to create a Jewish state. Of course, there were fragments of Zionism, Echad Ha'am, the cultural Zionists and so on, who spoke of a cultural center rather than a state. But they disappeared. I mean, they were utterly irrelevant to history. They're an interesting footnote, but really nothing more. And there are people who have come out against the genocide very vehemently. I mean, I think in this country, probably the most prominent of them is Owen Jones, the Guardian columnist, who played such a major part, incidentally, in the false anti-Semitism smears in the Labour Party. But I think we have to say to such people that what is happening is the logical extension of Zionism, that Zionism began with ethnic cleansing and it is now ending with genocide. And I know that some people, not least the Metropolitan Police, who arrested me last Friday for drawing the links between Zionism and Nazi Germany, don't like it. But this was exactly the same with in Nazi Germany. It didn't start off with a program of extermination. From 1933 to 1941, the policy was one of ethnic cleansing. Even up to the end, it subscribed to the Madagascar project, whereby it would transfer Jews to the island of Madagascar. It was only when, during the war, that was impossible, they turned to the final solution and the extermination. And the same is true of Zionism. I mean, we talk about genocide in Gaza. What we're talking about is extermination. Although the official tally is 40,000, it is accepted that for every death that is recorded, there may be 3 to 5 or even more indirect deaths. So we are actually talking of hundreds of thousands of people who are being killed through starvation, through disease, and so on. And we have to say to people like Owen Jones, it's time to recognize that Zionism is a genocidal project, and you have to face up to that, and you have to face up to all the illusions that you had that it was some form of Jewish self-determination. It's also, I think, never been clearer what Western imperialism is about, that it will tolerate absolutely any atrocity that you can think of. I mean, just imagine, for example, that Hamas planted a bomb in the middle of Jerusalem because it wanted to kill or assassinate Netanyahu. And it managed to, but it killed 100 or more people. Can you imagine the headlines in the popular press about the terrorism of Hamas, the brutality, the bloodthirsty savages that they are, etc.? Yet Israel dropped, I think it was 10 2,000-pound bombs in the middle of Beirut, a built-up city. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris welcome it. I mean, this, I think, should demonstrate to everyone that terrorism is only what our enemies do. We are never terrorists, however many we kill, however we kill them, in what methods we use. Terrorism is for the other side, or in the words of, I think it was Lord Carrington, the British Foreign Secretary, Thatcher's first, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. That applies today just as it has in the past. The other, of course, consequence is the attack on civil liberties at home. We've seen in Germany extreme repression of the Palestine solidarity movement, the physical invasion by the German police of the Palestine Congress, for example, the attacks on Jewish anti-Zionists just as much as Palestine solidarity supporters. The German state defines its reason to be as the existence of the Israeli state. Well, that, of course, is very convenient. But what they're doing is actually following in the footsteps of the Nazi state itself, because I've written about this in my book. The Zionists were the favorite children of the Nazis amongst the Jewish population right up to 1939, because they too agreed that Jews should not mix with non-Jews. So the German state supporting Israel, right or wrong, is a logical consequence of that. Many people, I think, who believe that the German state supports Israel as a way of expiating its guilt are actually wrong. I don't think there is so much as guilt as a need to actually normalize and relativize its genocide, not only against the Jews, the Gypsies, and so on, but also its involvement in both the Armenian and then the Herero Nama genocides in Southwest Africa. So Germany has a particular role, but it's also true here. I mentioned the fact that when I drew comparisons between Zionism, Israel, and the Nazis, I was arrested at the picket of Tzipi Hotovely, the Israeli ambassador to London, last Friday. I'm not the only one. People were arrested and have contacted me on the demonstration the following day. This has been a repeated pattern in Britain. It's one that we have to call out and we have to fight. But I mean, freedom of speech is under attack and under threat as a result. And not only just here, if we look at international law, the ICJ and the ICC, it is still the case with the ICC that the warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant have not been issued. It is going to a full panel of judges, I understand. Contrast that with the issuing of a warrant for arrest of Vladimir Putin. It took place on one day. There was no drawn out legal process. It went through literally in a flash. And I think that shows the politicized nature of the institutions of the international law. And although we appeal to international law, we can really have no illusions whatsoever in its efficacy, because the major gap in international law has always been the lack of any effective enforcement mechanism. And that's more true today than ever. I mean, we have the United States Congress debating whether to apply sanctions to the court for daring to issue warrants. So, I mean, that is the hypocrisy that we labour under. But it's also clear, and we see it very, very clearly, that the Arab regimes, many of which are integrally linked with Israel militarily and economically, are part of the problem. If the Arab regimes had said they were going to stop the oil on day one, the genocide would never even have got off the ground. They bear a major responsibility for what is happening. And in practice, many of them have given the green light to what has happened, the Saudi and the Gulf chieftains in particular. The final thing I just want to say, which is the title of this talk, is about two states. I mean, Britain's Palestine solidarity movement still refuses to take a position of opposition to two states. And my own view is quite clear. It is crucially important that the Palestine solidarity movement in all its aspects comes out explicitly against the illusion that there can ever be two states, that the Israeli state can live in peace with its neighbors or with its own Palestinian population. That is simply impossible. Two states is an apartheid neo-colonial solution, and we must treat it accordingly. It also enables many people, like our trade union leaders, for example, to both sides the question. On the one hand, they support the Palestinians, but on the other hand, they support the right of Israel to exist. Two states does indeed support the right of Israel to exist. So for that, if no other reason, we should be firmly opposed to a two-state solution, and the sooner the better. And that means in Britain that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign has to come out against two states and to forego all the excuses and the pretexts for not doing so, such as the Palestinians. It's a question for the Palestinians. We know very well that given the choice, a free choice, the vast majority of Palestinians would choose to live in one democratic state and not a Bantustan in the West Bank. But in any case, that is simply impossible. I hope I haven't taken up too much time, but thank you very much.
Thank you, comrade. Yeah, indeed. Well, PSC and the trade unions still support that fantasy of a two-state solution. And by the way, I doubt very much that international law exists independently of the imperialist powers in any case, even if it is an absolute thing, which I very much doubt. We're going to move on now to our second speaker, Ghada Karmi. Welcome, Ghada. And Ghada Karmi is a British Palestinian doctor who was expelled by the Zionist militias in 1948 from her home in Jerusalem, and is author of the book One State, the Only Democratic Future. Welcome, Ghada.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone watching this webinar. I want to start by saying how horrible the last 12 months have been for Palestinians and their friends. We never thought, look, I'm somebody who never had any illusions about the nature of the state of Israel. But even I have been horrified, devastated by the extreme brutality and savagery that we've seen in the last year against the Palestinian people. But the last year, of course, it was not just an expose of Israeli brutality. It was also a time in which masks fell from the faces of those hypocrites and liars who have misled so many people in the Middle East and in Europe and in the West. I'm thinking of the way that despite Israel's brutality, despite the fact that it is committing collective punishment, that it is in breach of every kind of international law and every kind of human rights norm, despite all that, it still enjoys support from the United States and other Western European countries. And one has to really try to understand not only that that is the case, but that this is very meaningful. And it puts paid to the idea that any of these pronouncements on the part of Western governments, which many Palestinians fell for, I think, and many other people also fell for, about a future Palestinian state, about supporting Palestinian right to self-determination, it's really exposed these as completely hollow. So it seems to me that apart from the brutality and the horror of the last year, we need to look at some lessons that we've learned. And so the first lesson is the one about hypocrisy, which I just mentioned. The second lesson is to do with complicity and the thing that we have to face, that the whole international system of law, of human rights, of decent behavior has been overturned. We know now that the very states of America and Britain, which were responsible for the creation of what we now consider international law, the creation of the notion of humanitarian law and norms of international behavior, the world order, if you like. These very states, which are responsible for that, when they met after the end of the Second World War, they are the very states that are actively acting to promote the destruction of these very same laws. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go into why Israel is so important to the West. It's so that it leads Western states to lose their not only reputations, but their money and their arms to support this Zionist project. So where are we heading with all this? Well, I terribly fear that in the short term, we're going to see things get much, much worse before they might improve. I say that because I am convinced that Israel has a fantasy in which it believes that this is the moment it's been waiting for. This is the opportunity of a lifetime where it will destroy all its enemies. So, first, it started with trying to defeat Hamas and destroying Gaza, and currently doing the same with the West Bank. Now it's moved on to Lebanon, where its fantasy tells it that it can destroy Hezbollah. And the next on the list is Iran. And I have no doubt that is where we're heading. I don't think that wiser counsels will prevail. The Americans will help Israel, will back Israel when it comes to it. And the Israelis are gung-ho because, as I said, they can't believe their luck. And they're certainly not going to pass up this opportunity. I was very interested that the ground is already being prepared in the West. Today, you will have heard about MI5's warning that Iran has all sorts of ill intentions and evil designs with regard to this country. Well, of course, I don't believe that. I believe that this is part of the way you prepare the ground for Iran being the enemy. And therefore, if you bomb it and do a lot of damage, then you're justified. So I think that's part of it. All right, so let us suppose, let's follow the fantasy. Suppose Israel is successful. Suppose it really does smite all its enemies. What's the end game of this? I often ask myself, do Israelis never ever ask themselves, what would be left in the region? Who would be the people in the Middle East region who would not hate Israel, who would not be angry, who would wait to plot and plan against the Israelis, and who would be determined to destroy the Israeli state? That seems to me to be obvious, but the Israelis don't think about it. So let me move on to the very important other discovery that the world has seen and we Palestinians understand very well. The last year has shown us that it is not just the government of Israel. We have to worry about the Israeli population, the Israeli Jewish population, which has supported its government in the genocidal war all the time, and even now, which we know from polls that have been taken, do not consider that Palestinians at all in this, that Palestinians have any rights, that they are human, that they are even human. The Israeli Jewish population is of that view. So, that poses another question about the future. I've always believed that the only possible outcome to this disaster is the creation of a democratic state in which the people between the river and the sea will live together in equality with equal citizenship, and that those people we know will be partly Palestinian Arabs and partly Jewish Israelis, as well as some other small minorities. That is the aim I've always had. It's the aim I've always wanted to work towards. However, for the first time, I've really begun to question something which may shock you. I really wonder if what we've seen from the Jewish Israeli population in this last year is one that would encourage Palestinians to imagine or to tolerate the idea of sharing the country of Palestine with people who feel like this. So I think in my concluding remarks, what I want to say is that, number one, the democratic one state in which there are equal rights and equal citizenship for everybody is the only possible destination there is for this tragedy, number one. Number two, it is the only possible way out of the Palestinian tragedy of not only being under Israeli occupation, but being in exile like me or living in refugee camps. The only possible way forward for all these groups of Palestinians is to go home. And the only home they will have will be a democratic state for its citizens. So that's the second. But the third point, which is really very clear, is that the current Jewish Israeli population and those who wish them well need to understand that they have to cast aside ideas of supremacy, of dominance, of superior rights, of the fact that the Arabs around them, the Palestinians, the Arabs, the other Arabs are inferior. They have to get rid of this mentality. Otherwise, we don't want them. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody in the world wants them. And it seems to me that this is a really urgent matter for those of us who care about the future to disseminate this idea, for people to start to try to understand that what has been created in Israel is not just a settler colony which occupies other people's lands, but what has been created is a particular mentality and a mindset which makes of the people who have that mindset a collective that no one really can live with. I want to end on that note, and I welcome any questions about what I've said.
We will take questions after all of our speakers, if that's okay. There have been a lot of comments in the chat as well about what Ghada is saying. And it seems it's inevitable that the only solution is a democratic single state. And the question is how we get there. There's a comment that, well, it won't be about Jewish Israelis living with Palestinians because it won't be an Israeli state. Fair enough. So let's hear our further contributions and then come back to questions to the panel. And I've been asked to change the order of speakers by Tony, but I need to make sure that's okay with Haim and with Rania. Haim, would you be happy to go next? And Rania, would you be okay to go at the end?
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you very much. Welcome to the meeting, and thank you for overcoming those technical difficulties. So Haim is an Israeli anti-Zionist. He's a research professor at SOAS and also a founder member of Jewish Network for Palestine that's co-hosting this meeting. He's the author of An Army Like No Other, which is a critical history of the occupation army and published in late 2020 by Verso. I'll put the link to the book up in the chat. Haim, welcome to our meeting. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. I'm not sure why the order was changed, but that's fine. I will try not to repeat what excellent speakers already said. First of all, what is happening is no longer about Gaza or even Palestine. It's about the West against the rest. And Israel is just part of this. The decline of the West, and especially of the US, is glaringly obvious. The empire, despite more than 1,000 military bases, is losing power to the new global South/East, militarily, financially, morally, politically. Israel is both the most aggressive of the Western Bloc, as well as the one who seemingly controls most of the Western agenda, which is strange because it's the smallest country in the West. The agenda is the war on terror, limited nuclear strikes, collective punishment, war on civilians and non-governmental organizations of resistance, the use of starvation, water, genocide, ecocide, domicide, herbicide, and scholasticide as weapons of war. Political assassinations, techno mass terror, you name it, they've done it, and they have made it a common feature of the West. Now, all these are fair games in the last war of the Western Bloc against the rest of the world, because this is what it is. This started in the 1990s and can only lead to worldwide nuclear war and civilizational decline, and probably descent into barbarity on the way. Now, the Western script is very simple. Without the support of the West, of course, nothing can happen in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen, of course, Ukraine, and the many other flashpoints. The period that is most dangerous in imperial life cycles is the decline and fall of great powers. The juncture of temporary vacuum as power shift from an old regime towards a new one. What Marx called all that is solid melts into air. Exactly what we're now seeing around us. This is positively frightening. The old empire is using all its considerable might to terrorize and cudgel the rising powers, which will replace it, no doubt. We see the total collapse of what is mistakenly called law and order or international law, and the political and societal bankruptcy of the rules of the game that they have instigated. The serious attacks starting with 9/11 and leading to the Ukraine takeover by NATO and the US in order to engineer a death blow to Russia is the clearest example. The script requires that the West does all which is illegal, immoral, and even irrational, at the same time speaking incessantly about human rights, democracy, freedom, and so on. So this is now a pattern that we all are aware of on this webinar, but a lot of the population are not aware because they're listening to mainstream media. So I want to talk about dangers and opportunities in a time of change. The period carries the danger of total destruction through fatal combination of ecocide and worldwide nuclear war, something not faced since the 1950s. With 9 countries with nuclear arsenals, and the nature of the atmosphere, both the physical and the political atmosphere, it makes limited nuclear strikes not just a disgusting meme, but the gateway to world destruction. And Israel has instigated this idea of a limited nuclear strike, and it is now planning to do it in Iran. However, at a time of change, it's also possible to see ending of empires like Western capitalism, unipolar imperial rule, and the turning back of the global ecocide. So in Palestine, it brought terrifying genocidal destruction as Israel perceives a chance for expelling all Palestinians. However, Israel shares in the decline of the West and exemplifies it. Zionism, manifesting its barbarity and extreme racism, now self-destructs through making the whole region into a circle of resistance. The demise of Zionism is already here in a death of 1,000 cuts. We can probably talk about it on question time. As societies predicated on genocide are not sustainable. This is very clear. So the period is a period of flux. We have experienced the establishment of the apartheid empire of settler colonial Zionism, which led to a single racist state in Palestine where the Palestinians lack any rights, including the simple right to live. Most people everywhere now understand this. This is universal now, due to the barbarity of the IDF genocidal war in Palestine, Lebanon, and soon somewhere else. Great dissatisfaction exists with the UN, ICJ, and ICC, and is very evident. An urgent change is called for. The global order, such as it was, is collapsing. BRICS and other emerging groups are building a new order, which may well be much more open to the interests of the Palestinians than ever before, and I certainly hope so. What about the two-state solution that the Americans, the Brits, and the Europeans are bubbling about? First, there never was such a solution. It didn't exist then, and it doesn't exist now because Israel killed it in the womb. And the West uses it still as some kind of ploy for supporting Zionist control that spreads over Palestine by the process that you know. Zionist society is now even less inclined towards even a small and insignificant Bantustan. There are no such undercurrents in its political arena or an alternative elite that might move this. The so-called left in Israel is even more keen on Islamophobic conflict with the whole region, with Israel becoming a psychotic, genocidal society. Any division of Palestine, any further division of Palestine will just serve to give Zionism a lease of life for rebuilding and returning to its destructive agenda. So despite the fact that it's not existing and it was never in existence, we should be clear, there is no cutting Zionism to size. It should be totally rejected outright. So in conclusion, what is required to have one state in Palestine? What is required is a thorough decolonization of Palestine, an arms embargo on Israel, a democratic union of all Palestinian social and military forces, a successful BDS campaign, which at the moment we are not seeing, ICJ and ICC taking the finger out and speeding up the processes, or they will become totally, untenable. A genuine international force to defend Palestinians. This was already demanded by Francesca Albanese in her recent report. A suspension of Israel UN membership. This was done to South Africa in 1972 because of apartheid. Israel makes that apartheid South Africa look like a picnic. The disbandment of the IOF, the Army of Occupation, a gradual effort for building a security force whose whose role is defending of the Constitutional Republic of Palestine and all its citizens, and the offering of minority rights in the Palestinian Republic to Israeli Jews who, like Arada said, reject Zionism and accept equality, just peace, and Palestinian return. No national rights can be offered to them, only full rights as citizens under the law. A process through which de-Zionization is affected will be required, unlike South Africa's half-hearted Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The new Republic of Palestine will require a new just constitution, meaning all Zionist laws, regulations, institutions, and special privileges to be totally annulled immediately. Israelis will become a cultural and religious minority with full rights, without the rights to propagate Zionism or apartheid, obviously. Those who refuse to accept an equal democracy may find a better place elsewhere and are free to emigrate, as was said before. Now, I want to end by asking a question that we are all asking. Is this possible? Can it happen? Definitely, it can happen and should happen, and will also be just and workable. The problem, as Rada mentioned, will be in the mindset of the post-genocidal population. Many Palestinians will find living with ex-genociders quite unacceptable. And who could blame them? I can't. I wouldn't like to live with Israelis myself. And I'm Israeli. Israeli Jews are so steeped in racism and Jewish supremacy that it will take almost superhuman will and social investment to set up and maintain such a republic of those two communities. If it can persist, that's what I want to say in hindsight. If it can persist for a couple of generations, and it's a big if, it will certainly survive and thrive. But the initial period will be dangerous and difficult, as we all realize. But nothing can be as terrifyingly awful as Zionism currently is, not just for Palestinians, but for everyone around, including most Israelis. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Haim. It was wonderful to hear from you the solutions that can be achieved with immense will, investment, and time, and building on Ghana's contribution about the inevitability of a one-state solution. So thank you so much. Our final speaker is Rania Khalek, who's a Middle East-based journalist for Breakthrough News, although I understand that Rania is currently in the US. And Rania is also co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. Welcome to our meeting, Rania, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And these are really excellent speeches. I'm just going to, I guess, maybe reiterate some of what was in them and add a little bit. And I mean, just to some of what's been said by Haim and Ghada, I think that, you know, I don't have the answers to this, but I think we're talking about some sort of denazification program or something even more serious than that. Once we get to a liberated Palestine, that, you know, some of what I'm seeing among Israeli Jewish society reminds me a lot of what I've read about in the Jim Crow South, and the sort of mentality that existed following slavery in the US. And so it's not pretty right now, and I don't really have the answers to that, but I think it's a really, really important discussion to be having very, very seriously at this point in time. But, you know, I had planned to spend my time talking about, you know, why one state and not two, because this was planned a while back. But, you know, I've spent the last 3 weeks kind of walking around in a daze, in shock, without really having the ability to process what happened the day before, because I'm watching my country of Lebanon be carpet bombed and now invaded again by the Israelis. I actually live in Lebanon, and I left 3 weeks ago to cover the UN General Assembly in New York just before the pager attacks took place. And since then, I've watched from afar as Israel expands its genocide in Gaza to southern Lebanon and to South Beirut, and parts of the Bekaa, you know, and they've displaced they've displaced at this point 1.2 million people. And this isn't a really tiny country. I mean, Lebanon is just under 6 million people. So a sixth of the population, more than a sixth of the population has been displaced. And they've already killed over 2,000 people. And that's, of course, on top of this year of genocide we've watched in Gaza that's probably killed in the hundreds of thousands. We just don't actually know the death toll. And it hasn't relented. So, I, of course, have spent the last year, like all of us here, feeling completely devastated and infuriated over Gaza, and I should say also inspired by the resistance to genocide. But there's something very different about watching it happen to your own home in real time. So I really don't know how Palestinians have done this for a year. And I really hope I don't have to do it for a year. But all that said, Israel is now about to go to war again with the backing of the sociopaths in charge of the US against Iran, on top of everything else it's already doing. So, because of developments in Lebanon, and now that we're on the precipice of this potential war with Iran, I want to talk a little bit about how this massive escalation fits into this conversation for the need of one democratic state in Palestine. Because as far as I see it, one liberated state in historic Palestine, the defeat of this settler colonial apartheid fascist regime, the dismantling of the Zionist project, this is absolutely necessary for the ultimate liberation of the region, but will also lead to a more liberated world. In other words, the liberation of Palestine is about more than just Palestine. Someone made the point to me recently that we're witnessing today a Nazi-like state, Israel, go about expanding its borders and genociding its neighbors. But unlike during World War II, the Allies are supporting the Nazis this time around. But I just thought that was a little ironic because, as we all know very well, the West did actually initially support Nazis as a bulwark against communism until the Nazis started attacking them. And then the West continued to support fascists and Nazis against communism throughout the Cold War, and Israel played a role in that fight. And today we see the West supporting the apartheid Nazi-like state of Israel against those who resist Western imperialism. And this, in the region of the Middle East, means Hamas and any other Palestinian group that fights for their survival. It means Hezbollah, it means Iran, it means the Yemenis, and so on. And they've also historically used Israel to do their dirty work around the global South, at times in Africa, very often in Latin America, against any movements aimed at supporting their own self-interest or sovereignty over American imperialism. And I think this is why we need to understand Israel as a reflection of, not a deviation from, the US. As Israel's genocide in Gaza reaches new heights of cruelty, many keep asking, why are Western regimes who claim to be the leaders of the free and civilized and lawful world, why are they enthusiastically supporting the belligerent annihilation of Gaza? It seems they've gone crazy. They're willing to destroy this world order they worked so hard to create, all to protect Israeli apartheid. They're even willing to provoke regional war with Iran for this tiny little settler state. And the Biden-Harris administration plays into this. They want us to believe that they just can't get a handle on Israel, that they have no leverage over the Israelis, that Israel is this uncontrollable mad dog, that they're trying so hard to influence the Israelis, to limit their atrocities. But we know this is a lie. The US is in the driver's seat. They just want plausible deniability. It's gaslighting to say you want Israel to stop when you send them $22 billion in military aid since October 2023 and squeeze all their adversaries with sanctions and regime change schemes while letting Israel unleash US bombs on them. So the question becomes, what does the US gain? We know that Israel is their weapon in the Middle East and even beyond. Like I mentioned, Israel's participated in so many US dirty wars around the global South. And we shouldn't fall for this idea, this lie, I would say, that Israel and its lobby or some sort of Jewish lobby are running US policy. I mean, there is an Israel lobby and it does police politicians, but it's just an arm of the military-industrial complex that helps reinforce US military imperialism in the region and beyond. And so that's why they arm Israel to destroy Gaza, to bomb Lebanon, to kill Iranian nuclear scientists, to arm fascists in Latin America, to mow down international law. It's to secure American interests in the region and around the world. Like Biden himself said, if there weren't an Israel, America would have to create an Israel. Biden keeps saying he doesn't want a war on Lebanon, doesn't want a war with Iran, but his own advisors, Amos Hochstein and Brett McGurk, were quietly greenlighting an Israeli attack on Lebanon to weaken Hezbollah in early September, while they were publicly luring the resistance into a false ceasefire proposal. Then Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, and now Washington and Israel are drunk on a false victory. They see that Hezbollah has taken some really serious blows, and there's no doubt that they have. And they want Israel to keep going into Lebanon, into the south, while the Americans squeeze Lebanon politically to try to weaken Hezbollah. It's a team effort. And we know global North leaders are racist. They don't see Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, the jungle people of the global South, in the words of Joseph Borrell, as human. But I think the most important factor in their support for these crazy escalations is what October 7th meant to the Western imperialist project. What Palestinians did in the Al-Aqsa flood operation struck fear into the hearts of Western leaders. Palestinians broke out of their cage. It was akin to a slave revolt. And as history has shown, no slave revolt goes unpunished. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Ursula von der Leyen, they don't take kindly to indigenous people in the so-called jungle shooting at their precious garden. And Israel is one of their gardens. The West is backing the Gaza onslaught as a part of a genocidal drive against the oppressed people of the global South. They're sending a message that this is what happens if you dare strike back militarily against their rotten, colonial, capitalist, hyper-imperialist system. Israel versus Gaza, and now the region, is the imperialist West versus the global South. The imperialists have created a world where a small group of ruling elites led by the US very effectively steal from the global South to maintain their hoarded wealth. And if this system collapses, they lose everything. They are desperate to prevent anyone who refuses to comply with their system from building a better world. This system has destroyed so much for hundreds of years, and its maintenance requires a constant evolution and control and domination, and it won't tolerate any resistance to it. That's why they sanction over 30% of the world. It's why they overthrow governments and invade and collapse misbehaving countries. It's why they kill babies and destroy hospitals and create famine. They literally shorten lifespans as a matter of policy. This system is so parasitic, and Haim was speaking to this before, that they're willing to destroy the world if it means preventing the collapse of imperialism. The genocide in Palestine, it's a microcosm of how far they're willing to go. I mean, look no further than their willingness to risk nuclear war with Russia and China to see how psychopathic their ambitions are. And let's not forget, Gaza, in addition to being a concentration camp turned death camp, is also a laboratory where Israel and its Western backers can test the most brutal methods of domination and control on those marked as unpeople, right? The people of Gaza were marked for death a long time ago. They were put on a diet. They were placed under siege. They were subjected to carpet bombing campaigns every few years. Those methods have been exported around the world to be used on other marginalized populations to uphold this imperialist order. We have to consider this context when we watch Gaza and now Lebanon face a kind of annihilation, because we're entering this era of climate disaster and a crisis of capitalism, combined with a gradual decline of US empire, the most violent empire in history, which is terrified of the rise of China and an assertive Russia, and again, is willing to risk nuclear war to prevent it. I also want to point out that as somebody who's in media, Breakthrough News, make sure you follow it, we're watching in real time the media and global North political leaders cover it all up, but their propaganda this time around does not match up to the images of reality. That's why the genocide in Palestine has exposed the imperialist narrative of the mainstream media, even beyond Palestine, which raises questions, right, for a lot of people when they watch the reality of these images versus what CNN is saying. If they lied about 40 beheaded babies and about Hamas mass raping Israelis, and they're actively ignoring actual gang rapes of Palestinians that are on video, right? If they're covering up Israel's use of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th and Israel's summary executions of doctors and patients in hospitals, if they're promoting Israel's fabrications about Shifa Hospital being a Hamas headquarters to justify dismantling Gaza's health facilities, what else are they lying to you about, right? People see there, and I mean, that's something we constantly highlight at Breakthrough News, but people see these people see these differences in reality versus the media, and it makes them ask questions that if the media lies about Palestine this much, maybe they're also lying about other adversary countries the US wants to destabilize, like China and Iran and Venezuela. Palestine is an inflection point that's permanently discrediting the corporate media to much of my generation and younger, I would say. And then I want to make a quick point just about anti-Semitism, because obviously we see this still being used to shut people up and to smear people. You know, they want us to believe that opposing apartheid, that opposing genocide is actually an act of anti-Semitism. We all here know that's BS. You know, there's nothing anti-Semitic about that, but actually they're the anti-Semites. Imperialists, the US imperialists do not care about Jews. They never have. They are using Judaism as a shield for imperialism, which is the most anti-Semitic thing you can do. And what's more ironic than the fascistic forces of the imperialist West that once genocided European Jews to then go and use them as cannon fodder on the front lines of their imperialist project in the Middle East. And to that I say the liberation of Palestine will hopefully also liberate Jews around the world from being tricked by Zionism into moving to a disgusting settler state and potentially dying for Western imperialism that uses them as cannon fodder. And just to say really quickly about Lebanon, before I end here, I know everybody is really worried about Lebanon. And again, I'll mention, Hezbollah has experienced a lot of blows in the last few weeks. Their senior military leadership has been largely eliminated. And we saw the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah using 85 2,000-pound US supplied bunker buster bombs to take out 6 apartment buildings in the densely populated South Beirut suburb. Killing God knows how many people. And it's a huge loss. It's a huge loss for the resistance across the region. That said, Hezbollah is a horizontally equipped organization as far as its leadership goes, and they're able to replace people quickly. And their command and control in the south of Lebanon is still intact. And they are fighting back in an Israeli invasion on Lebanon. And we're probably going to see the Israelis actually invade this week. So far, we've seen the Israelis do these tiny raids, kind of going in a few hundred meters and sort of dipping their toes in and then leaving very quickly. And they've experienced casualties as a result of that. But I just want to remind everybody, Hezbollah has spent his entire existence preparing for an Israeli invasion. So we have to wait and see what happens, because Lebanon's future is really dependent on how Hezbollah performs in South Lebanon today. But we shouldn't allow Israeli propaganda about Hezbollah being on the precipice of collapse to lead to any sort of defeatism here for Lebanon. Moving forward, the U.S. is also obviously in the driver's seat here. They see a huge opportunity to take out all their adversaries in the region, and they are squeezing the Lebanese government right now and trying to install a president of their liking so they can create a government to their liking. It's the same script we've seen before. It's going to do a lot of damage, but I don't think it'll work. But again, I don't have a crystal ball, so we'll have to wait and see. But we have to remember, Israel has not achieved any of its military objectives in the last year. They haven't managed to dismantle and destroy Hamas. They're not going to be able to dismantle and destroy Hezbollah, even if they can give it a lot of blows. And, they just keep expanding their military objectives while they haven't reached previous ones. And in the long term, I think, it's going to do a lot of damage, but I just don't think any of this is achievable. They're making the entire region hate them, and people are going to keep fighting them as a result. So just to end on here, Israel's doing exactly what U.S. imperialists want it to do. It's attacking any force that fights U.S. domination in the region. And that includes Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Iraqis, the Yemenis. These forces refuse to submit to Western domination. They refuse to be slaves to the U.S. And for that, they're being punished with extreme depravity by a U.S. empire that is slowly waning in power, but will do an insane amount of damage on its way down. That said, Israel is the U.S.'s greatest asset, its biggest investment in policing its adversaries. And that's why I'll go back to the original point here. The liberation of Palestine is a requirement for the liberation of the region and much of the third world, because it will mean the dismantling of a genocidal apartheid regime that destroys for the U.S. Still, we know the West, even with its waning power, is well organized and ideologically in sync. So the question becomes, can the South and its allies in the West confront this moment? Palestinians are operating under the most difficult of circumstances to push for a liberated future, which one democratic state needs to be at the heart of that. Because of this hyper-imperialist West is the greatest danger, not just to the security of the Middle East, but to humanity. What happens in Palestine, we need to remember, will not stay there. The horrors we're witnessing are a lens into what they have planned for their adversaries and people like us in the future. So we need to get organized. We need a liberated Palestine if we have any chance for a liberated world. And those of us in the imperial core countries need to stay in the streets. We need to keep pressuring our governments. We need to keep pushing for BDS and doing everything in our power that we can, where we're situated, to help lead to a liberated Palestine. And I'll stop rambling. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening.
Not rambling at all, Rania. As Tony said, absolutely brilliant. So we're going to take some questions from the floor, just a couple of observations. A number of people in the chat have made observations about Christian Zionists, as well as in the imperial powers supporting Israel. And I note what Rania said about, well, the imperialists don't really care about Jewish people, they care about Israel and Zionism, but probably the perspective of Christian Zionists is different. And I think your analysis, Rania, was saying, tying with what Haim said about overthrowing the regime, that the South needs to rise. The question is whether imperialism will destroy its main asset in the Middle East, or whether the imperialists will have to fall and the South rise. So let's go on to questions. And at the end, I'm going to ask all of the panelists to give their final observations, having heard each other and having heard the discussion in the meeting. So we'll stop that after about half an hour. So we'll take questions from the floor now. I'll take a few at a time and direct them to panel members. If you want to ask a question of a specific panel member, please say so. So we've got 3 hands raised at the moment. And I know, Marie, if you can raise your hand as well, because I know that you wanted to ask a question. Les, I saw some of your comments in the chat, also tied with some comments by Bill. So shall we take your contribution first, please?
Okay, thanks.
Continue, dear one, if you...
I would put on the video if I could figure out where.
Okay, well, we can hear you anyway.
Okay, yes. Yeah, thanks to all the speakers. I mean, this event overall rightly advocates that the Israeli settler colonial apartheid regime be replaced with one democratic state with universal equal rights for all. Question is, how can we, in the broad sense, get from here to there? We know much better what is the enemy, that Israel is carrying out a joint US, UK, EU genocide. You know, Israel is the front for that effort. So I want to suggest an analogy with apartheid South Africa, which was defeated by several means. In effect, the anti-apartheid movement, both within and outside that country, turned the regime into a liability for Western imperialism, which then withdrew its support. In order to replace the Israeli regime with one democratic state, is it likewise necessary to turn Israel into a liability? Or even more ambitiously, would it be necessary to defeat Western imperialism itself? Either way, how can the entire Palestine solidarity movement, both there and globally, achieve sufficient force? So I conclude there.
Yeah, thank you, Les. That picks up on some of the observations that I just made. I'm sure the panel will be able to come back on that. Shall we take contribution now from Marie? Hello, Marie. If you're able to
mute, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Oh, you've just gone off again. Can you unmute, please, Marie?
Yeah, unmute.
That's it. We can hear you now.
Okay. Well, it's a great meeting. There's people from all over the world. The great speeches. I think that what we are looking at is this democratic state. There is no doubt that, of course, it's required. It's not going to happen in the circumstances where we are, but we can already put that question together with what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think it's been demonstrated by others before me that there is a trend towards wanting to kill those who are in power. They do not see the target as a military thing they must oppose, but people. They want to attack people. And so I think that it needs it's not true that this is not possible to actually tackle this, because already there's millions of people who intervene in the streets for the Palestinians. So it's not like we're starting from nowhere. And I would like to just make a final point. I have noted that in the US, a company called Two Lanterns Venture Capital provides slices of funding in a non-profit accelerator system for startups in panelists.
Yeah. So we're hoping to see you. Carry on, Marie. You need to unmute again, Marie. Thank you. That's better. Please unmute.
Unmute. Oh, right. Now, I don't mean to pretend to be a very, as knowledgeable as the people who've spoken, but I thought our friends Rania and also the other comrade, I forgot his name now, spoke extremely well about the world process. And I see, now I want to finish this, I see that there are venture companies, venture capital, which is now being invested on a big scale in Israel, because in Israel there has developed in its warmongering, it has developed the ability to see which other more perfected weapon is required. And then Israel has the ability to say that this is a proven weapon which has been proven on the ground. And this is now being moneyed, and investments, making startup companies, big investments is going there by the billions. And I will write this down somewhere else in order to be short. But the result of that is that there's incorporation of Israel's top military and financial sector with the world imperialist complex of military and finance system. So in fact, it's not like yesterday when capitalism was, still improving or being capitalism. Now it is in fact just high finance imperialism, and that sector has no interest in people. It's only interested in for a few, and could the rest of us please die? And I think that I want to congratulate Haim, who spoke very well, much better than me about this. And I call on comrades to see the need to have street and local organizing people's assemblies of, we go to demonstrations and go home. No, we have to stay mobilized and to have a constant, permanent functioning. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I think Greg's being added to the panel by a comrade. Greg, did you want to make a contribution before we go back to our panelists for responses?
I did, thanks. I'd like, first of all, to comment on something that Les said, and then I'll ask my question, which is different. I actually disagree with the way Les described what happened in South Africa. What actually happened in South Africa is that the upsurge internally turned the regime into something that couldn't survive. And the decision of the imperialists to walk away from it came after it was clear that the regime was going to collapse. And what they were betting on was that apartheid could be ended in a way that would protect capitalism. And that is what happened. But the reason it happened was because that was actually the aim of the ANC. And that's the real story of what happened in South Africa, not that the thing became a liability and then the US turned their back on it. It was about to fall when they turned their back on it. Anyway, that's by the by. My question is that this really does depend on what Palestinians think and what they choose to do. And so the question is, what do we think the current attitude of Palestinians is to the prospect, to the possibility of a one-state solution? That is the most important question, I think. And I think that Ghada, and maybe Haim also referred to the possibility that this was going to be very difficult because of what we've just been through over the last year. But nonetheless, I think some focus now has to come on the question of how is this debate going on there? Because we are not in a, we can articulate the argument from outside as to why a one-state solution is the best solution, but that doesn't get us anywhere unless it's resonating inside Palestinian society. So I'm really asking a question of fact. What is the state of play in that debate internally? Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I'm going to just bring the panel onto the screen now so that they can respond to those 3 points. If you can help Matthew, please. And we'll spotlight each of the panel members. Tony and Haim. Okay. Oh, where's Rania?
She's there.
Okay, so we've got these points, and let's ask the question again about the route to achieving the state. Marie's point specifically about high finance, which was addressed to, by Haim, but Haim may want to add to that. And then there was a point by Greg, which I think, what's the view of the Palestinians and what do the Palestinians want? And Haim and Ghada and others may have a view on that. So who on the panel would like to begin to respond to one or any of those points raised by our attendees, please?
I'm happy to take the points about how to achieve this and how do Palestinians feel. Well, these are really key points because in the end, we can suggest a way forward. We can talk about what would be the best solution for this problem, but without being able to point to a way in which it can happen or even begin to happen, I think it loses the value of the point. Yes, indeed, that is really the key question. How can we achieve this? I've often thought about this, and in terms of what do Palestinians want, we don't fully know, because opinion polls have consistently shown in the past a support for the two-state solution, although support for the one-state idea has gained ground. So that is the actual situation. Now, we don't know what's happened to all of that as a result of the genocide. We do know anecdotally that for Palestinians, the idea of actually living together with the criminals who've destroyed your lives is absolutely impossible. It's not so my suggestion has been, when I talk about this, is that when we want to talk about the creation of a democratic state, we have to try and see it as a long-term destination. That is sort of the point where we aim to reach, not immediately, not at all. And I would therefore say that nobody can, at the moment, things are so severe, they're so bad, it's not possible to talk about long-term needs. But I would add that there are things on the way to this. The more people talk about the one democratic state, the more the idea takes on, the more it becomes familiar. So, as you know, with all political ideas, there's two stages. First is the acceptability of the idea. Do people think it's desirable? And only at the second point is, do they think it's feasible? So it's that way around with one state, in my experience, it's always been messed up. You start talking about the one democratic state idea, people jump up and say, it can never happen, Israel would never let you, etc., etc. But of course, loses the point. You actually have to get the acceptability of the idea to be much more widespread, universal than it already is. That's stage one. And then the pressure of that agreement with the idea leads us onto the stage two, which is how do we make it happen? And that I think is the way around it should be, and that's the way we have to think about it.
Thank you, Ghada.
Can I continue?
Hi, next. Thank you.
Right. I totally agree with all that Rada said. And I want to say that there are ways of starting the process, and which is what we need to do. I'm part of ODSC. I think Rada is also part. I'm on the executive of ODSC, which is probably the largest group. And it is based in Palestine and has Palestinian leadership like all the other groups. And that is the first problem. The first problem is there are 3 or 4 one-state groups. What we tried, myself and Palestinian colleagues, over the last 3 months, without success yet, but I think we're trying again all the time, is to bring those groups together. Because if we want one state, we also want one large group arguing for it. And that's understandable and agreeable. At the moment, it is stopped by something very important. One of the groups, the one that I'm a member of, is actually close to the idea of binationalism. I totally am against it, and I think most of the groups are against it. We need to resolve that. And I think we are going towards resolution. I hope so. And once in my talk, I was speaking against binationalism, because binationalism is just giving a lease of life to Zionism. And no one should do that. No one at all should actually be confused by the idea of binationalism. Now, there are some signs that this is now understood, or getting better understood even by Israelis. They started 4 different groups for confederation or federation between Israelis and Palestinians. This is evidence that they know that, the clock is ticking and Israel is on the way out. When I and many others are saying that Israel and Zionism are on the way out, we are actually looking not at the world fighting Zionism, which I wish it was, but it wasn't. It isn't yet. But actually what happens inside Israel? Israel is falling apart. Israel is more divided than any other society on earth. The only thing that they are united about is against the Palestinians and for genocide and attacking Iran and attacking Lebanon and attacking anyone that raises their head. But everything else they disagree on. So Israel is actually not tenable anymore as a society. It's definitely not democratic even for Jews, and let alone for Palestinians. So in a sense, Les is not right, I think, when he talks about the viability being an international issue. The viability for the West of Israel is going down all the time, because of all the crazy plans that the West is coming up with, from Ukraine to a war on China and Russia, and nuclear war, and of course, attacking Iran. So in a sense, the West is now also in a process of falling apart. And I just want to say that one of the things that many of us in the different parts of the campaign for one state have realized and are now doing is a project called Bring Gaza Home. And that's, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about what we do about the Gazans, 2 million people now, because around 300,000 were killed. So 2 million people are going to die if Israel is allowed to continue. So this is a project, we've published an article about it in Al Jazeera, please have a look at it, of actually bringing the one state through helping the Palestinians of Gaza, bringing them, forcing Israel through a list of measures which I enumerated, so I will not repeat. And these measures can be done. South Africa was knocked out of the UN for misdemeanors in comparison to genocide. So it's possible to do that. It's possible to create an international force. It is possible to force sanctions on Israel, whether the Israelis like it or not. Who cares if they like it? It doesn't matter if they like it. It's like saying, oh, we can't actually end the war in Ukraine because Zelensky wouldn't agree to it. Zelensky is a puppet. If the Americans want to end the war, they will end the war tomorrow. If the Americans want to end the genocide, they wouldn't arm Israel like they do. So basically bringing the people of Gaza into Israel so their life is saved will restart, will kickstart, if you want, the one-state solution by starting the return process, al-Auda. This is very important.
Thank you very much, Haim. Tony, Rania, do you have quick comments to make, or shall we move on to our next batch of questions?
Yeah, no, I do have a few things.
Okay.
I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism today, and possibly the beginning of the end of imperialism as we know it as well. Regardless of what the Palestinians want or desire, and I believe most of them now desire a one-state solution, that is the only possible solution that can possibly be achieved. Two states is a complete illusion, and we're wasting our time and diverting our energy if we even go down that road. Binationalism died in 1948. There's no point in resurrecting a dead body. It's simply useless. Of course, there are comparisons with South Africa, but they're limited because South Africa depended on the exploitation of black labor. Israel does not depend on the exploitation of Palestinian labor. Israel is far more genocidal than the South African state was, and that is a key difference. But the other point to mention is the Palestinians by themselves don't have the strength or the power, just demographically, apart from anything else, to overthrow Zionism. It is a region-wide conflict. It is absolutely necessary that the client comprador Arab regimes are overthrown by the Arab peoples. They are complicit with Israel. When you look at those pathetic figures, the king of Jordan, the Saudi king, and all the rest of them, they are partners in crime, junior partners, but partners in crime nonetheless. They have to go as part of the overall struggle. I have no doubt that if Israel is seen to be a liability to imperialism, if it's realized that Western interests are in danger, then Israel would be dropped. There's no morality in US imperialism. It has no affectionate bond with Israel. They may claim it now, of course, but they'll eat their words in the day if it has to be. Their economic and imperial interests predominate. So we should be under no illusions whatsoever as to the task before us. And the task of the solidarity movement, first and foremost, is to delegitimize the Israeli state and to say that we want a democratic state, not a Jewish supremacist state. We have to be very clear, whatever organizations we're in. And any organization that says it's a Palestine solidarity campaign must take a support for a one state as given. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Did you want to come in, please?
Yeah, I wanna just add to what everybody else was saying, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And I know there are difficult days ahead, and we've all been watching very difficult days. And I'm not trying to make it sound like it's some sort of cakewalk, the defeat of Israel and the Zionist project. But I just want to remind people of a few things, because it's not just what we do in the West. There is, as Tony mentioned, there is a regional war taking place right now. The U.S., since the fall of the Soviet Union, has been really focused on constantly reshaping the Middle East to its liking. And it hasn't actually worked, because we are in 2024, And there are the Yemenis, the Iraqis, the Iranians now, the Lebanese and Palestinians all firing at Israel. They're making it really not pleasant to live in Israel. The Israelis are literally like, just today, Hezbollah fired like 100 missiles at Israel and hit Haifa. Same thing happened yesterday. Hezbollah is firing ballistic missiles at Israel, and some of them are actually landing because, yes, Israel has this 3-layered air defense system, but it doesn't protect it from every missile. And it's going to get worse. The Yemenis are firing ballistic missiles at Israel. The Iraqis are firing, I'm not a military expert, so please, I think it's ballistic missiles, but if it's not, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. But the Iraqis are firing and hitting Israel. Palestinians yesterday on October 7th, after a year of genocide in Gaza, Hamas managed to fire at Tel Aviv? I mean, I woke up to news yesterday that Tel Aviv was being hit. So all that's to say, Israel is suffering. It's going to actually need to suffer more for it to concede anything ever, because the problem is that, you know, as the Israelis like to say about the Arabs, all of their existence, we only understand force. It's one of those every accusation is actually a confession situations. The Israelis actually only understand force. And so that's what you see happening in the region right now. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the resistance axis and Israel are militarily comparable in any way. Obviously, one of them has far superior weapons, far superior technology in every way because of everything at its disposal by the US and the Western countries. But regardless of all that, I just want to point out again that for the last year, since last October 7th, when Hamas paraglided into their former villages, basically, and did a lot of damage, and it was completely chaotic. Israel has been trying to reestablish its military legitimacy since that day. So yes, the society is consumed by hate and obviously an expansionist Nazi-like agenda. But that said, it has to do also with reestablishing their military legitimacy, and they haven't done that yet. They haven't achieved any of their military objectives. It started out with defeat and dismantle Hamas, return the hostages. Neither of those two things have happened. They also added to those objectives to return their settlers to the north. Not only has that not happened, they are actually, as a result of their war on Lebanon, they're expanding the radius of where Israelis aren't going to want to live or be able to live anymore. So they have internally displaced people for the first time ever in their own country, which is something that Hassan Nasrallah, in every single speech he's given since October, repeatedly mentioned. That is doing damage to the Israeli psyche. It's doing damage to Israel's ability to have a functioning economy because of how much industry is based in the north that can't function right now. And also this entire war is doing damage to Israel's economy. And yes, the West right now can continue to fill those holes, but also if you're like a Jew living comfortably in the West, you're not going to want to move to this place. It's a disaster with a bunch of crazy people living in it. So Israel's also losing out, or going to lose out more on that demographic influx it's constantly relying on, because people aren't going to, want to make aliyah if this continues, and they're being fired at by the entire region. So we have to take those things into consideration. Also, as people feel incredibly demoralized and defeated, I know this has been going on for 76 years, but this sort of ramp up in depravity that started a year ago, I mean, liberation takes a lot of sacrifice. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but Algeria, in the course of 10 years, 1.5 million people were killed, but they did liberate themselves from French colonial rule. I mean, I hope it doesn't get to that. I'm just reminding people, how long did South Africa exist before it didn't? A pretty long time. I mean, you go back in history, how long, have a lot of go back to the Soviet Revolution. How long were people across the Soviet Union living under horrific czar and monarchy and feudalism before they liberated themselves? I mean, the liberation means sacrifice. There's going to be a lot of loss in that process, and it's not going to come overnight. How long did it take to defeat Nazi Germany? This has been a year. I hope this doesn't go on for 5 or 6 years, but we have to understand this is a long war and there's going to be a lot of loss. And for those of us who are sitting in comfortable Western capitals, it is on us to not feel defeated and to not get demoralized, because there are people over there operating in the most difficult circumstances. They are fighting for their lives from underneath tunnels. And one day that's going to be written about as the most valiant and heroic fight against genocide ever. So the least we can do, where we have food to eat and water to drink and lights to turn on, is not get defeated, demoralized, go show up at protests, organize with your local community. I mean, do what you need to do and what you can do in your capacity to help this along. And that's all I can say on that. I don't have all the answers, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Rania. As Marie said, well said, and your points about, well, Israel is clearly not invincible. Iran has struck back, and very subtly, and shown that it can strike if it wants to. And we've heard a lot of evidence about Israel being well on the way to, if not already, a failed state. Not least that every Israeli is going to have to be, or is, conscripted. So not a great place to be. We've got two people promoted to the panel with further contributions, questions. Mark and Steve, you can make it brief, because we do still have three other people wanting to ask questions, and I want to allow the panel to feed back their final observations at the end as well. So if you can speak first, Malcolm, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, I will make it very brief. A lot of people have been talking about the idea that Palestine might become a democratic state. I mean, what I find interesting about that is, I think in the whole of what might be called the Muslim world, I don't think there is a single democratic state. There was something called the Arab Spring, and a lot of us thought something might happen, and of course we all know what happened with that. As Tony's pointed out, the Arab states all around have been sitting on their hands. They're all loaded up with Western weapons, no doubt, etc. So first of all, I don't know why anybody thinks that Palestine suddenly, the Palestinians will suddenly turn themselves in from Morocco to more or less Pakistan, can turn themselves into a democratic state. And the other thing is, one person mentioned the idea of de-Zionization of the Zionists who live in Palestine. Well, that's a sort of nice word, but I mean, it seems to me completely impossible, given the level of hatred that must exist. I mean, I'm not from that area, obviously, but I mean, if I was, my level of hatred of, if I was Arab of any sort, my level of hatred would make it impossible for me even to sit in a room from somebody from who was a Zionist, let alone live next door to them and sort of help them take their kids to school, etc., etc. So I don't know how anybody thinks de-Zionization could possibly take place. I mean, what seems to me you need is a sort of reverse Nakba, but that, of course, might seem to be a bit unpopular. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. If panelists consider Malcolm's point while we move on to Steve. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Esther. Thank you for the panel for all their contributions, and I'm going to go back to something which Tony said died in 1948, but here we go, it's going to come again, which is binationalism. I want to bring that up, although not the same as it was in 1948, because I don't think there was an Israeli nation in 1948, and I don't think there was a really Palestinian nation really in 1948. So that's something that's come out of 70 years of struggle, the emergence of two distinct nations. So I think we could talk about it now if we couldn't talk about it then. You have to make a distinction between the Zionist state and the Israeli nation. And the Israeli nation's got 80% Hebrews and 20% Arabs. And everybody seems to forget that 20% of Israelis are Arabs. So if we just like South Africa, got rid of the apartheid state, but that liberated the South African nation from apartheid. So similarly, Israel could get rid of, in theory, a Zionist state, and the Israeli nation could be liberated from Zionism. That seems to me at least feasible. Or they couldn't do it without Palestine. So without the Palestinian people, that it seems to me would never work. So I'm in favor of one state for two nations. I think there are two nations contesting that space. and there has to be a democratic way in which they can coexist together. So I think Haim's idea of a constitutional republic, or I would call it a federal secular republic, it must be secular. It cannot be an Islamic or a Jewish religious state. It has to be secular. That is quite revolutionary, a thought in itself in that area anyway. I didn't have time to talk about, I think Haim took us on the right track by beginning by talking about putting it in the context of world imperialism, but I'll leave that aside. I think that was the right track to take. I think two states died on October the 7th. I mean, this might seem odd. I think it was complete. You could argue it was dead before, but I think what happened on October the 7th finally killed two states. Although, and this is why it's contradictory, more people talked about two states than ever before. I mean, everybody started talking. The more dead it was, the more everybody talked about it. But it was killed by that rebellion. There's not going to be a two-state solution. There wasn't going to be one before. I think, as people have said, it long since died. But that was the end of it.
Thank you, Steve. So I would like, we're actually running into the time that I wanted to give to the panelists for their final conclusions. So I wonder if you could, dear panelists, provide your closing comments and perhaps respond to Malcolm on how can we possibly achieve this, how could Palestinians possibly live alongside Zionists, and Steve's point about two nations in one state, which is a slightly different aspect of the discussion to what we've discussed so far. So can I call on you, Tony, first? Bear in mind you've only got 2 or 3 minutes to sum up, and if you want to respond to Steve and or Malcolm. Thank you. You're mute, please.
Okay. I mean, firstly, it has been a wonderful meeting, and we have had, I think, a really good discussion. I don't agree with Steve that two states died on October the 7th. It was never alive in the first place. There was no chance whatsoever that Israel would ever agree to it. I also don't agree, and I know this is the position of some Israeli anti-Zionists like Matt Penn, that the Israeli Jews constitute a nation. Now, I don't want to go over the history of the debates as to what constitutes a nation, but what binds Israeli Jews together, first and foremost, is their antagonism to the Palestinians. It's not some indigenous organic history and culture that has grown up. Take away that antagonism, take away the Jewish supremacy, and they will probably fall amongst themselves. There is no unifying factor once you take away Zionism. And so to suggest that you have an Israeli Jewish nation, I think is really a way of resurrecting Zionism by the back door, and I would oppose it. There has to be one Palestinian state. And incidentally, just as the whites in South Africa were white South Africans, I mean, I know some of them wanted a separate white state, but that was never feasible. So the Jews in Israel who remain will be Jewish Palestinians. They may not like it. They will have to lump it, I'm afraid. That is just how things are. That is the price they will pay for their own defeat. As regards Malcolm's point about the level of hatred, I mean, yes, I heard the same thing in Rhodesia and South Africa. The level of hatred is such they'll never come to terms with it. Take away the state structures that perpetuate supremacy, and then they do come to terms with it. It will be difficult, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. But once the American guarantee, once the imperialist interference, once all the rest of it is removed, then the material basis for that hatred also disappears. And being a Marxist, I look at the material base, not the ideological superstructure, first and foremost. And that's why I say it's going to be a long struggle. And it's going to be a bloody struggle, as Rania said. I agree with that. But I do believe, along with Ilan Pappé and others, that we are seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism. The situation today cannot continue indefinitely. We have to see the de-Zionization or maybe the denazification of Israel, because it cannot continue as it is. And in the process, imperialism itself may be fatally wounded. But as I said, we also have to see the end and the overthrow of the Arab regimes, which are also perpetuating the Israeli state, the land corridor between the UAR, Jordan, and Israel. You know, the support they're effectively giving to that genocide. Those regimes must be made to pay the price of what they've done. It's absolute treachery. And I look forward to their overthrow. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been a great meeting. It's a great pity that Ali Abu Nima could not have come, but he had food poisoning, so I think we can forgive him.
Yes, we'll pass on our best wishes to Ali. Thank you for that additional comment at the end, Tony, about the surrounding supporting states. May I pass over to you now, please, Ghada?
Right, thank you very much. Just really a couple of points. The question of no democracy in the Arab world, therefore, how very unlikely that you could have a democratic state instead of Israel-Palestine. I don't buy that, really. It doesn't. It's most unhelpful. You set up, if you're going to set up, you have a project. Your project is defined as a situation in which there are equal rights, equal citizenship, one person, one vote. Clearly, that is a democracy. You don't really need to dress it up any other way. The question of de-Zionization, look, this is essential, but it will not happen by somebody telling Zionists to abandon Zionism. Of course not. And it won't happen by any kind of educational course. The way it will happen is by the force of circumstance. So when you've actually got a context in which Zionism cannot survive, then Zionism will be discarded. Finally, the question of two nations. Now, you know, I hear this a lot, and I cannot stress strongly enough that what we're dealing with in Palestine is a settler colony that has been imposed on an indigenous people. That's what we're dealing with. So one has to adjust one's vision to start with. If your starting point is that there is something called Israel, Israelis, and that it represents something real in the national sense, then there's no way forward from that. One has to start from the truth. And the truth is that what we have in Palestine is a settler colony, called itself Israel and called its people Israelis, and is living inside Palestine against the will of the Palestinian people. That's the real situation.
Yes.
So I don't have any issue about binational. There's no such thing as binationals. Finally, just one word, if you'll allow me. You know, I've heard it on during this webinar, as well as with many others now, the announcement of the coming death of Israel. You know, I can understand, I agree intellectually. I can agree with the sentiment. I agree even with the logical conclusion of what's been happening. But my fear is that while Israel is dying, if it is indeed dying, it will cause enormous damage, enormous destruction. That is what my real fear is. So in a sense, while we're commenting on its demise, it will already have attacked so many people, might well be attacking Iran, might well be provoking something very large and very, very frightening. So that is really my fear. And we must not, though comforting, it's very comforting to think of this Zionist project coming to an end. Of course, it's very comforting, but we have to be realistic as well. It's not dead yet. And in its dying throes, if indeed they are, it will cause enormous hardship and damage to the region and to its people.
Yeah, thank you, Ghada. So the destruction of the parasite will be in itself extremely destructive. Thank you. Over to you, Haim, now, please, for summing up, and if you wish to respond to those final comments.
Sure. First of all, thanks to Rada for removing us from the alien field of two nations that live in some kind of space which doesn't exist, and putting it into the reality of a colonial regime and the people under its jackboot, which they have been for more than the 76 years of Israel, because the British Empire before has done the Zionist work for them. So actually, Palestinians have never lived in an environment which was democratic or conducive for democracy. And yet, I have been involved in working and also making films about the different intifadas. And I have never seen a more democratic nation than the Palestinians when they are allowed to express themselves without, you know, at the time, in the first Intifada, about 600 children were killed for throwing stones. This was a murder of little children. And Palestinians did not use arms. They used politics. They used actually mostly women, because the men were in jail, use democratic politics and decision-making of the type that I wish I could see in this benighted country of Britain, which, you know, some people here are saying the Arabs are not democratic. I mean, Britain is a democracy. Britain that created the problem of Palestine is now the example of democracy. The Labour Party is a democracy that supports genocide. I'm not talking about the Tories. So we could be here until the cows come home. There is a kind of Islamophobia inherent in the idea that the Arabs are not democratic when thousands of Arabs died in 2011 fighting for democracy against the West. So I think we should be very careful about that type of sentiment, which actually is somewhat racist. Now, I think that the most important thing that we need to think about is indeed the end of Israel, because as I said about the United States, the worst time is when empires are going down. And there is no doubt, I'm sure in our fourth mind, that Israel will cause enormous damage on the way down. And what we as the people outside the region can do and must is to actually make this impossible or minimize it. And we can do that by some of the things that I suggested through the UN. And that will, very interestingly, needs a total change of the UN. The UN is a Western undemocratic institution where the US can veto and stop anything. And this has got to go. This is a relic of the past, and it is not logical, it's not legal, it's not justifiable. The UN needs to be an active organization for peace and equality, and it isn't that. And I think Palestine might place it in a place there that they need to change the UN. This is one of the things that is very urgent, because without a change, the United States will lead us all to destruction. So yes, the Israelis are very good at killing people, and they will kill more people. And, you know, the French killed 1.5 million Algerians, and yet they had to leave. Israel will have to disappear, and it is now disappearing in stages. It is indeed a death by 1,000 cuts.
Thank you, Haim. And last but not least, Rania, would you like to give us your closing responses and comments, please?
Yes, this was fantastic. I'm so lucky to be with such a great panel of people. And Haim, you took the words out of my mouth. We don't have democracies in the West, so I'm not sure what democracies in the Middle East we should be comparing to. And I mean, I'm not going to go too deep into this because there's no time, but it will be interesting to see that if there is a broader escalation with Iran, you know, China and Russia haven't done anything materially so far. I mean, rhetorically, they've been very supportive of those being attacked by the Israelis, but they are close allies of Iran. And so I am curious to see if they would be willing to stand by. You know, I'm not saying they'll involve themselves militarily, but Iran is, you know, the US taking down Iran would be a huge security risk for both of those countries. So I'd be curious to see what they might do in the case of an actual attack on Iran to like overthrow the government. But I also think we have to balance in you know, the big picture sense, being realistic about the difficulties ahead, yes, to everything everybody said, with also not, again, feeling defeatist and demoralized, because it is a long road ahead. And I want to use the example of Vietnam. You know, the Vietnam War was horrific. It went on for more than a decade. You could even say a couple decades if you want to take it back even further. Vietnam suffered so much, and it had a very strong resistance in North Vietnam. And ultimately, the Americans were defeated. And today, Vietnam is an incredibly successful and powerful country. And I mean, that's different, but I just think it's important to remember that because people were up against so much trying to end that horrific war. And I'm going to end by plagiarizing a very good friend and comrade of mine, Vijay Prashad, who always tells this story about Ho Chi Minh. That a group of Europeans, I want to say it was Italians, but I might be getting that wrong. So I'm just going to broadly say Europeans who were quite revolutionary, had gone to visit Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. And they asked him, what can we do to help? Like, what can those of us in Europe do to help? And he said, go home and do revolution where you live. And, you know, we know what he meant by that, right? Like, go to your imperial core and do revolution in your countries because your countries are the problem. And so those of us who are in the imperial core, again, we have a certain kind of power here collectively to organize, not just against what our governments are doing, but against this disgusting, parasitic, capitalist, imperialist system, because that is at the root of all of this. It's at the root of the problem when it comes to Palestine. It's at the root, the whole region, all these Arab regimes that are in collaboration with Israel and the US. It's, you know, I'm going to go back to it's, you know, socialism or barbarism. And so those of us in the hyper capitalist imperial core countries, we have to be pushing for socialism in our own countries in the ways that we can. And so I guess I'll leave it there.